The night of July 9th, 1871, was supposed to be like any other for the small congregation that gathered in the wooden chapel on the edge of town. The preacher, a man who ruled his family with iron discipline and his church with the fire of Scripture, had called a special evening service. His congregation obeyed, as always, filling the pews with whispered reverence. Lantern light flickered against the rough timber walls, the air heavy with hymns of devotion. But what none of them saw was the silent figure moving in the shadows at the back of the chapel, his very own daughter, born into her father's shadow. She had endured years of his authority, his lectures, his punishments handed down as though from the hand of God himself. She was expected to be obedient, pure, submissive, the living example of his dominance over both family and faith. But inside her heart a storm raged, and on that night it burst into flames. As the preacher thundered from the pulpit, his daughter carried with her a small oil lantern, the kind every household owned but few thought twice about. With trembling hands, she tipped it at the back corner near stacked kindling, the glow of fire catching and spreading with frightening speed. Within moments, smoke curled upward, unnoticed at first over the droning sermon. Then came the screams. Flames devoured hymnals. Smoke turned the holy air to choking ash. The congregation rushed for the doors, but they found them blocked. Secured from the outside, the preacher had promised to bring his community closer to God, but it was his daughter who baptized them in fire. Before we continue with this chilling story of obedience, twisted into vengeance, do one thing for me. Hit that subscribe button right now and tap the bell icon. Because here we uncover the forgotten tales of America's darkest history, the stories they never told you in school. In the years before the devastating fire of 1871, the town of Ash Grove, Missouri, was not much different from countless other rural outposts scattered across the 19th century frontier. Wooden storefronts lined muddy streets, the blacksmith's forge rang at dawn, and wagons clattered endlessly past as families tried to carve a semblance of order out of the wilderness. But for those who lived within the reach of Reverend Josiah Talbot's voice, life was defined less by the frontier than by faith, or more accurately, by his version of it. Josiah Talbot was not just a preacher to the 200 souls who filled his chapel each week. He was their shepherd, their moral compass, and, in his own eyes, their unquestioned master. Tall, gaunt, with sharp cheekbones that caught the lantern light dramatically, he looked every part the prophet he fancied himself to be. His voice carried with unusual strength, a low thunder and prayer that rose to a storm when he warned of sin. Every Sunday his congregation sat pressed tightly on the benches, their eyes lowered, drinking in each syllable as though their salvation depended upon it. And perhaps for them it did, because Reverend Talbot's religion was not the gentle balm of forgiveness. It was fire and brimstone, punishment and obedience. His God was not one of tender mercy but of wrath, constantly watching, ready to strike. He preached that submission was salvation, that questioning authority, the Lord's or his own, was the first step toward damnation. And as the community's most educated man, few dared challenge him. The preacher's reach did not end at the chapel doors. His home, perched just behind the church, ran on the same rigid creed. His wife, thin, timid, and rarely heard, served as the silent enforcer of his law, while his children endured the daily weight of his expectations. Meals began and ended with Scripture. Chores were demanded without hesitation. Personal wants, laughter, or youthful disobedience were to be crushed like weeds before they ever sprouted. And above all, there was his eldest daughter, Ruth Talbot. From the moment she could speak, Ruth was reminded she was not her own. She was her father's prized example, his living sermon, as he called her. He dressed her in plain cotton gowns, forbidding ribbons or colors that might stir vanity. He scrutinized everything she did, how she sat in the pew, how she prayed at the table, how she walked through the dusty streets of town. If she ever smiled too brightly at neighbors, Reverend Talbot's voice would boom later in their parlor. Pride is sin, Ruth, and in this house sin burns away under discipline. His discipline was not mere lectures. He wielded the rod, the stern hand, and the humiliations that left scars less visible but far deeper. Ruth was ordered to read scriptures aloud nightly, while her brothers and sisters knelt in silence. If she faltered, stumbled over words, or cried under the pressure, her father barked that her spirit was weak and must be purged. At 16, she was expected to manage the household under her mother's instruction, but with the preacher's relentless oversight. The smallest errors, such as a floor left unswept, bread baked too dark, or fabric torn at the seam, were treated as moral failings. The congregation looked upon Ruth as the embodiment of piety. Young girls were told to follow her example. Older women praised her meekness, even as they whispered uneasily about the preacher's strictness. To outsiders, she was a model daughter. To those within the house, she was a prisoner living under constant surveillance. But even iron cages have cracks. Ruth's thoughts, those dangerous sparks her father feared, grew sharper with age. In stolen moments with her younger siblings, she whispered doubts. If God is so forgiving, why does he punish us for being children? She envied the laughter of neighbor girls who braided their hair and danced barefoot in summer evenings, while she was marched indoors to memorize yet another passage of Leviticus. She longed quietly but desperately to be free, not of religion entirely, but of her father's suffocating grasp. It wasn't only Ruth who chafed beneath Josiah Talbot's rule. The congregation too felt the weight. While Talbot preached salvation, what they often heard was condemnation. Their children were scolded for slouching in pews, their trades judged as too worldly if profit outweighed prayer, their occasional indulgences, dances, fairs, even small gatherings for cider declared Satan's snares. Yet they followed, because to leave would mean exile. No preacher, no church, no community standing. And so, life in Ash Grove carried on, with the Talbot family as its uneasy centerpiece. Outwardly upright, inwardly burning with pressure that few could see. By 1869, Ruth was nearly 19, a young woman by society's standards, but still treated as a child within her father's home. Prospects of marriage were carefully filtered through the preacher. Suitors were rare, and those who visited quickly recoiled from Josiah's sermons of control. One young man, a farmer's son named Matthew Clay, lingered long enough to court Ruth in small ways. An extra hymn shared, a gentle gift of pressed flowers slipped into a book. But Josiah discovered the exchange and erupted in fury. He denounced Matthew publicly from the pulpit as a wolf seeking to corrupt his flock. The young man left town within the month, and Ruth's heart hardened under the chains her father fastened around her future. Whispers grew among parishioners that Ruth seemed different. Colder, perhaps. Her eyes, once meek in the front pew, now carried an intensity that unsettled even the most devout. Mothers noticed the way her hands trembled when she turned the hymnals, or how she flinched when her father laid his hand on her shoulder in guidance. But as always, whispers never left the lips to become accusations, and then came the diary. In 1870, Ruth began what her father might have called blasphemy, a secret journal hidden beneath the floorboards of her small room. By flickering candlelight, she wrote words she could never speak aloud. She described her father not as a man of God, but as her jailer. She recorded the bruises her brothers bore when they displeased him, the nights she cried in silence, the ache of watching freedom exist everywhere but within her home. And most dangerous of all, she wrote of her longing for rebellion. I am his daughter, but not his possession. One entry read, "If the world must burn for me to live free, then so be it." These were the seeds of the fire that would consume them all. As 1871 dawned, the nation around Ash Grove reeled with its own upheavals. Reconstruction, conflict, poverty, the world was changing. But within Talbot's chapel, little had changed. Attendance waned slightly as some families drifted, yet enough remained to keep the preacher's authority solid. For Ruth, however, each sermon, each lash of his tongue, each iron grip of his hand was another strike against an already fraying cord. By late spring, whispers in town grew louder. "The girl looks haunted," they said. "Her eyes are not the eyes of the obedient anymore." And when July came, Ruth had stopped merely recording rebellion in her diary. She had begun to plan it, the lantern oil, the wooden beams cured and dried under the summer heat, the blocked exits, a service where every voice but hers would sing. What no one knew, what no one could suspect, was that the preacher's daughter no longer prayed for salvation. She prayed only for fire. By the summer of 1871, Ruth Talbot had entered a state of quiet determination. The years of silent suffering, the secret tears cried into her pillow, the hidden diary beneath her floorboards, all of it had congealed into something sharp and immovable inside her. She was going to act. No longer did she dream of escape or whisper doubts to siblings too frightened to repeat them. The plan was already taking shape in her mind, every detail etched like scripture into her thoughts. It was no sudden madness, but a slow-burning resolve that came from a lifetime of control and humiliation. Each night, she sat within her small room, candlelight flickering over her hunched frame, and rehearsed what would need to be done. She had seen how quickly oil caught fire when lamps tipped. She knew the timber of the chapel had dried after weeks of summer heat, prime for flames to leap in moments. She knew, too, that her father insisted on evening services with every door bolted from the inside, a display of his conviction that God shut the ark against the flood, and so his house is shut against distraction. To Ruth, those bolts were no longer locks of reverence. They were the iron teeth of a trap. The elements of destruction were ordinary: lamp oil, kindling stacked near storage, the lanterns her father's congregation depended upon for sight in their dim chapel. All she needed was the will, and it was not lacking. She began to test things slowly. One day in June, when everyone believed her to be hoeing the dry garden, she slipped behind the church, placing tiny dribbles of lamp oil on firewood stacked there. She lit it cautiously, letting only a small flame curl upward, then stamped it out quickly. Her heart pounded, her skin slick with fear. But she wrote in her secret journal that night, "It burns faster than he preaches. The wood is thirsty, and the oil feeds it as surely as blood feeds the body." The congregation had whispers too. They noticed the girl's changing countenance. Ruth no longer looked meek or cowed in the pews. There was a strange calm in her eyes, an unsettling stillness, as if she had heard a secret none of the others could know. One woman nudged her neighbor during a midsummer sermon and whispered, "She looks different," almost like she's ready to speak back. But no one would dare speak against Ruth openly, because to question the preacher's daughter meant questioning the preacher himself, and his thunderous sermons left little room for rebellion within the flock. Her father remained oblivious, in part because his certainty in his own authority blinded him. Josiah Talbot saw in Ruth not rebellion but chastening. If her silence was deeper now, to him it was proof that his discipline was working. If her eyes gleamed oddly, he called it a spark of conviction. He had no idea that what smoldered in her was kindling, not faith. The planning was meticulous. On nights when her father stayed late in his chamber, Ruth learned the weight and angle of the wooden bolts across the chapel doors. Children were sometimes asked to latch them before services, and while others struggled, Ruth memorized just how firm they closed, how quickly they could be slid into place. She knew once they were locked from the inside, panic would only make them harder to remove. She also mapped moments when noise would cover her action. Hymns rose with such force during the climax of services that her father's voice seemed to rattle the windows. During those hymns, no one would hear the creak of her lantern's tip, the sharp sizzle of oil meeting flame, the drift of smoke into the rafters until it was too late. The diary became a blueprint. One entry, never meant for other eyes, captured her thoughts in chilling clarity. "Perhaps they will call me a murderer. Perhaps they will call me mad. But I know the truth. He has stolen my years, caged me from life, twisted God into a whip. They sing for him, not for salvation. Let their voices be my thunder when the fire answers back. Better their screams in honesty than their silence in slavery." Her siblings noticed something too, though they could not name it. Ruth, who once comforted them in whispers after punishments, grew distant, even secretive. A younger brother told a neighbor years later that by that summer, Ruth seemed like a stranger in their own kitchen, moving with resolve, but never confiding as before. She smiled at them rarely, but when she did, there was steel beneath it. The congregation went about their lives unaware that their evenings in the wooden chapel were numbered. Crops were thin that summer, and talk in markets was often of drought, war veterans returning broken, or losses still unhealed since the nation's bloody conflict. The little church remained their anchor, their place of relief from the world's chaos. Each Sunday, they filed in under the preacher's booming voice, never dreaming the preacher's own daughter had marked them for her rebellion. One small warning almost surfaced. In late June, a passing peddler saw Ruth near the chapel alone at dusk. She stood near the stacked firewood, a lantern in her hand, though the night was not yet dark. Something in her gaze unsettled him. When he mentioned it lightly at the tavern, laughter met him. Ruth Talbot, the meekest girl in the county. She wouldn't strike a match without her daddy telling her when and where. A farmer chuckled. The comment was forgotten as quickly as it was made, but Ruth remembered every doubt she scribbled into her diary, and each night those doubts hardened into intent. She began storing extra oil where she could, small jars tucked beneath the floorboards in her room, wrapped in cloth to keep them hidden from her mother. She traced every path of escape she would need after the fire took hold. One door left unblocked, one window she could slip through when hysteria filled the chapel. She planned not simply destruction but her freedom, bought with ash and cries. Her father's sermons, especially fierce that July, poured kerosene on the fire already inside her. One in particular she could not forget. Standing before a packed congregation, Reverend Talbot thundered about obedience. Fathers, rule your houses as God rules creation. Daughters, submit to the Lord himself, for rebellion is witchcraft, defiance is death, and the wages of disobedience are the flames prepared for the wicked. To Ruth, sitting in the front pew, those words felt drenched with cruel irony. She clenched her fists so tightly her nails bit into skin. The flames he promised were the very flames she was preparing to bring down upon him and all who knelt under his dominion. By the time the first week of July dawned, the townsfolk noticed a strange heaviness around Ruth. She walked more slowly through markets, her face a careful mask, but her eyes betrayed something unshakable. Neighbors would later recall that when she passed, silence followed, as if some ancient instinct recognized danger, even if minds refused to admit it. And then came the final preparations. The day before the fire, Ruth recorded in her journal, "I have prayed not to God for he is deaf, but to the fire. The fire hears me. The fire answers. Tomorrow it will give me back myself." The next evening the congregation would enter the chapel for worship. They would stack their hymnals, bow their heads, murmur their prayers. And above them, lanterns would flicker innocently, shadows curling against dry timber rafters. Only Ruth, trembling with the weight of her plan, knew what waited beneath that fragile peace. The preacher's voice would thunder once again. The hymns would rise, souls convinced of eternal safety within those wooden walls, and Ruth Talbot would tip her lantern into history. The night of July 9th, 1871, closed in with no storm in the sky, only the thick humidity of a Missouri summer pressing down. The wooden chapel glowed faintly with light from its many lanterns as the congregation filed in. Men removed their hats, women adjusted bonnets, and children clutched hymnals. The air was heavy with dust and sweat. But to Reverend Josiah Talbot, it was another evening to thunder from the pulpit, another chance to remind his flock of sin's weight and heaven's narrow road. Outside, the town lay quiet, fields shimmering under the last pink burn of sunset. Ruth Talbot, dressed in her plain white cotton gown, moved silently among them, lantern close to her chest. No one gave her a second glance. She was the preacher's daughter, dutiful and silent. Why would they suspect her? Yet her hand shook slightly as she passed down the side aisle of the chapel. The service began as it always did. The Reverend's booming baritone echoed across the rafters. "Let us lift holy voices!" The first hymn swelled, rustic voices unpolished but resolute. "Rock of Ages, cleft for me." The pews hummed with devotion, the little windows steamy with the breath of souls pressed close together. But Ruth's heart pounded in a rhythm all her own. She had rehearsed this moment for months, yet now, as she slipped into the shadows near the rear of the chapel, she felt the weight of the act. She touched her hidden jar of lamp oil, fingers slick, and whispered inside herself, "If freedom is fire, then let it burn." When the second hymn rose, the sound of a mighty wall of voices rising high, Ruth bent low, tipped her lantern toward the pile of kindling stacked carelessly in the corner. Oil sloshed, flame touched wood, and at once a small hiss leapt into an orange tongue. At first no one noticed. The Reverend's voice rolled over the smoke, but shadows lengthened in unnatural ways as sparks started to crawl along the beams. Smoke licked upward, curling above the hymn books, subtle at first, just a haze. A child coughed in a back pew. A woman fanned her face, assuming the air had grown too warm. Ruth's hands trembled, but she did not stop. She spilled more oil along the side wall, kicked aside straw with her shoe, and soon the flames surged, feeding on every dry surface. Lantern glass cracked in the sudden heat. Timber groaned. By the time the hymn ended, the fire was alive. A scream broke the prayerful silence. Heads snapped back as tongues of fire erupted along the back wall. Embers fell like rain upon the hymnals. Smoke thickened, choking and stinging the eyes. Yet when men rushed to the doors, their hands slammed against the bolts, locked fast, sealed tight by the preacher himself to keep the faithful within. Panic was instant. Voices shouted over one another, women clutched their children, men hammered at wooden bars that refused to give. The Reverend himself shouted from the pulpit, "Remain calm. The Lord will test his people." But his voice, mighty as ever, cracked with fear. The chapel became a coffin of fire. Flames galloped along rafters, turning psalm boards into sheets of burning ash. Smoke filled lungs. People sank to their knees, gasping. The fire roared now, hungry and merciless, drowning out voices once raised in prayer. And Ruth? She slipped through the one bolt she had deliberately left unfastened at the far side window. Crawling into the night air, the sky cool against her sweat, she clambered up to the hill overlooking the chapel. From there she turned, drew in the sight, and watched. From outside, the chapel was a lantern of hell. Orange flames painted the timbers. Black smoke unfurled like a banner announcing doom. Screams echoed faintly even over the crackle of consuming wood. A mother's shriek, the deep cry of men battering walls with shoulders. The eerie collapsing hymn of voices gasping for breath. It was the chaos Ruth had imagined again and again in her journal. One man burst briefly from a window frame, his arms clawing into the night, only to tumble back inside when smoke blinded him. Sparks leapt into the air like fiery insects, and the town, hearing the commotion, began to gather. Neighbors cried out, racing toward the chapel only to recoil as waves of heat pushed them back. Horses screamed in their stables, panicked by the smell. Dogs howled at the flames, and in the center of it all, the preacher's voice tried to command order, until it faltered amid smoke, turning to coughing, sputtering rage. Some swore they heard him still shouting scripture even as beams groaned and gave way. Others claimed his final words were curses thrown toward the unseen betrayer who had lit the spark. Ruth stood utterly still, her face flickering orange under the glow. For 19 years she had been told she was nothing but her father's possession, his obedient extension, his example of purity. Tonight that lie collapsed into the ash with his congregation. Tonight she was the fire, uncontrollable, undeniable, destroying the cage that had bound her. From the town square, men shouted to bring water. Buckets sloshed, but it was useless. The fire was too large, the night too dry, the congregation already trapped. Families fell to their knees outside, weeping for those screaming within. Children reached out, only to be dragged back by mothers shielding their eyes from the horror unraveling behind those blazing doors. The roof collapsed with a thunder that shook the earth. Sparks mushroomed into the sky, raining embers across nearby yards. The bell, once calling worshippers, dropped with a final screech into the inferno. Within minutes, the chapel was a smoldering pyre, its 100 voices silenced down to a few final cries before nothing but flames remained, and Ruth Talbot turned away. Lamplight danced across her face, but she felt no tears, not for the flock, not for the father who had thundered so long about obedience. For her, the fire was not a tragedy. It was deliverance. Each scream behind her was another chain broken, each crash another weight lifted. For the first time in her life, she tasted freedom in the air, even though it reeked of burning flesh. Down in the town, chaos churned. Men scrambled in disbelief. Women shrieked. Some tried to rush inside to save those they loved, but smoke forced them back, coughing, blinded. Others collapsed tearfully, watching husbands, wives, and children vanish into the blaze. The terror of that night would scar their hearts forever. But Ruth, standing apart on the hill, knew she could never return. As dawn broke, nothing remained of the chapel but cinders and twisted iron nails. Bodies were blackened forms within the ruin. The once proud pulpit was another pile of ash, and those who had survived outside stood weeping, clutching one another, their faces painted gray with soot. They called it a tragedy. They said it was an accident. But whispers would grow louder in time, whispers that the preacher's daughter had been seen alone that evening, whispers of her strange quiet, her haunted eyes. There were whispers that she had turned the bolts herself, and for Ruth, who had vanished into the fields that night, the fire was not an ending. It was the beginning of a life scorched clean by her father's hand. Dawn arrived heavy and gray over Ash Grove on July 10th, 1871. Smoke still curled from the ruins, drifting skyward in thin black tendrils that stained the morning light. The town, which had fallen into chaos only hours earlier, now moved in stunned silence through the charred skeleton of what had once been the community's sanctuary. Men with ash streaked into their beards clawed at collapsed timbers, searching desperately for any signs of life. Women clutched shawls to their faces, shielding themselves from the stench of burned wood mingled with something far more pungent, the sickly sweet odor of charred flesh. The churchyard, once a place of potlucks and hymn singing, had turned overnight into a graveyard. Families clustered in groups, weeping and staring in horror at the blackened shapes that lay within the wreckage. Not all bodies could even be recognized. Some were fused, limbs and torsos indistinguishable. One mother screamed until her voice cracked when a neighbor retrieved a small hand charred beyond identification from beneath collapsed beams. By day's end, the numbers whispered through town. Nearly 60 dead. More than half the congregation had perished in the blaze. It was the largest tragedy any of them had ever witnessed, shrinking the town's very spirit beneath loss. The preacher himself had not survived. His body was discovered near the pulpit, collapsed upon scorched boards, mouth frozen open as if still shouting scripture. To those who found him, it was grim confirmation that even his sermons had not protected him. In public words, the townsfolk called it an accident. Lanterns had a way of falling, flames spreading faster than hands could douse. Some insisted that God's anger had descended upon them as a kind of Old Testament judgment. A purging, muttered one weary elder, staring at smoldering ash. A scourging for sins we did not confess. But within whispers at kitchen tables, in corners of taverns hushed to secrecy, another story formed suspicion. For everyone, one thing was noticeable: the bolts on the doors. They hadn't given at all. Men shouldered them, even axes were tried, yet it had been impossible to force them free. And while this was long considered the Reverend's iron ritual of obedience, doors closed and stayed closed once service began, now it seemed a cruel mechanism of their entrapment. The thought gnawed at survivors. If someone had moved those bolts into place knowing fire would come, then the tragedy was no accident. It was a slaughter. And then there was the preacher's daughter. Ruth Talbot had long been a silent fixture at the edge of every gathering. But the night of the fire, there were murmurs that she had been seen slipping away, her figure outlined faintly against the fiery glow, before screams reached their peak. Others swore she had been inside, but somehow escaped while no one else could. The contradictions only heightened the unease. Her siblings could not defend her. Her youngest sister and brother had perished in the blaze. Those who survived in other families recalled Ruth's haunted gaze in the weeks before the fire, how she stared too long at flames when lanterns were lit, how her eyes no longer mirrored meekness but something steely. Yet suspicion without proof was dangerous. Who would dare accuse the preacher's daughter openly? Even dead, his authority lingered in habits of fear. In the weeks that followed, Ruth was nowhere to be found. Neighbors searched, but she had vanished as though the night swallowed her whole. Some swore she fled across county lines, taking with her only a small satchel and the diary that had driven her rebellion. Others whispered that she had drowned herself in the river, overcome by guilt after tasting freedom bought with blood. With no body, no certainty, she became less a person than a legend. For the survivors, the fire marked an irreparable scar. With no church, they met under a tent hastily erected in a field. Families sat with faces stiffened by grief, hymn books scorched and blackened clutched as relics of those lost. Men swore never again to let one man's voice wield such total power. Some drifted away entirely, abandoning Ash Grove to start fresh in towns with less shadow. Women clung to children tighter, warning them that even holy places could harbor evil unseen. Yet for all the vows to remember truth, whispers persisted. There were stories of a young woman matching Ruth's description seen in Springfield, working under another name as a seamstress, her eyes shifting nervously when asked about her past. Others spoke of encountering her years later on lonely back roads, hardened and silent, traveling with no home at all. To the pious, these tales painted her as a restless soul, wandering unredeemed, forever chased by the flames she had lit. But another strain of legend grew too, one that turned Ruth from villain into avenger. Young women whispered to each other in private that perhaps she had not been wicked but brave, daring where they were docile, burning her father's prison to ashes. Whispers said she had lit the match not out of madness but out of desperate justice, breaking chains when no one else dared. These tales weren't told loud in public, for the dead in the fire were too many, too revered. But in kitchens and late-night circles, some spoke of Ruth as a martyr for freedom. In truth, nobody could ever fully untangle guilt from salvation in her act. Was she a monster who slaughtered innocents to escape, or was she a daughter crushed until madness left her no other escape than fire? The answer shifted depending on who spoke, and in that ambiguity, Ruth's story grew larger until it became less history than myth. By the fall of 1871, Ash Grove had rebuilt some of what was lost, but the air around it was never the same. Where once stood a chapel, now stood charred timbers, avoided by children who said the ground still whispered. The bell, cracked but salvaged, was never rehung. It lay rusting by the smithy, a reminder of the night when its call turned to screams. Reverend Hooper, a neighboring minister who came to offer comfort, wrote in his journal, "The fire robbed them of their sanctuary, but it revealed something more. It showed that faith without mercy becomes tyranny, that obedience without kindness becomes cruelty, and cruelty breeds rebellion, even unto flame." His words, shared in pamphlets, spread Ruth's tale far beyond Missouri, carrying it as a cautionary legend into other towns that tightened bolts a little less firmly and watched their preachers with more discerning eyes. For decades after, the preacher's daughter of Ash Grove would surface in ghost tales and sermons alike. To some, she was a cautionary example of sin devouring dutiful women, proof that rebellion against fathers led to horror. To others, she was a tragedy born of control, a reminder of what happened when men believed themselves infallible. And to a few, she was whispered of as something in between, both victim and villain, both child and monster, both prisoner and fire starter. And the truth of that July night still smolders in questions with no clean answer. Did Ruth hear the screams as horror or as freedom's first hymn? Did she ever wonder about those children she burned along with the man she despised? Or did the weight of her father's hand justify in her heart that the whole town had enabled her suffering, and so the entire village deserved to burn? The people of Ash Grove never agreed, but every time lanterns swayed within their homes, every time dry wood creaked in summer heat, their minds replayed the image. One plain young woman, eyes steady, walking away from a fire that consumed them all, and that was enough to ensure Ruth Talbot never truly disappeared, even if her body was never found. For she lived on in the uneasy silence of every congregation that wondered, how far could obedience be pushed before flames consumed even faith itself? In the years that followed the fire of 1871, the story of Ash Grove fractured into many truths, each version shaping Ruth Talbot into someone different. To some, she was a murderer who betrayed her town. To others, a victim crushed by life under her father's control. And to many more, she became something in between, a ghostly figure of both pity and horror, whose real motives were swallowed by the flames the same way the chapel had been. Some believed it had all been an accident. Wooden churches across Missouri had burned before, and oil lamps were fragile things. A single lantern could slip, spill, and ignite a building dry from the summer heat. They wanted the disaster to be nothing more than a cruel twist of fate, easier to live with than the thought of one of their own deliberately consigning them to the fire. They consoled themselves with scripture, with the notion that Providence had chosen this crucible of loss for reasons beyond their understanding. But the accident theory was hard to accept for a long time. Too many details unsettled the survivors. People remembered the doors, bolted so tightly they could not be forced, though men threw themselves at them with every ounce of strength. They remembered Ruth's strange silence in the weeks before the fire, her eyes smoldering as if she carried a secret no one else understood. Some swore she was seen near church firewood on more than one evening, lantern in hand, her face unreadable. And one boy, half blinded by smoke as he squeezed out of a side window, later insisted he saw Ruth leaving, her figure walking calmly uphill as flames consumed the building behind her. His was the only child's voice, but in a town torn open by grief, even a boy's testimony sank like nails. Others saw her not as a villain, but as a scapegoat. They whispered about her father's household, the long years when she was made a public example of piety, the heavy hand of discipline that left her flinching like a bird in a storm. For them, it was the Reverend who bore true responsibility. He had bolted the doors every week. He had ruled his home with tyranny, and he had shaped Ruth into someone desperate enough to believe only fire could set her free. In this telling, the congregation was not wholly innocent either. By bowing to his will for so many years, they had allowed that iron control to spread unchecked. They had all looked away whenever Ruth's shoulders stiffened under her father's hand at the pew. They had heard whispers of his severity, but silenced them for the sake of keeping their preacher untouched. And when the fire came, it was easier to blame Ruth as the devil's daughter than to face the truth that their own silence had helped build her cage. Her story refused to stay fixed. In taverns and parlors, voices argued into the night about what they remembered. One man insisted Ruth was seen smiling at the blaze, lips turned in something hideous. A woman claimed through tears that she saw Ruth weeping instead, tears lit against her cheeks by the glow as she vanished into shadow. Some believed she had meant only to frighten her father, perhaps singe timbers or disrupt the sermon, to lose control of the flames. Others swore there was no accident in the way the fire spread, no hesitation in the way she prepared, and so Ruth became myth. Parents told their children her name as a warning. Girls were reminded that disobedience could end in their ruin. Boys were warned against women who strayed from obedience. Firesides filled with ghost stories in which Ruth's face appeared in lantern flames, or her footsteps lingered near the ashes of the chapel lot. She became less a memory than a haunting, looming in the imagination of a community too fractured to settle on truth. But not all remembered her as a demon. In whispered circles, especially among women, another interpretation dared not be spoken loudly. They said perhaps Ruth was not monstrous but courageous, striking back at a life of suffocation. They quietly admired her defiance, though horrified by her methods. In their telling, she was a dark emblem of rebellion, a tragic reflection of what desperate souls might do when all choices are stripped from them. These whispers never became open speech, but they survived in the hidden conversations between daughters and mothers, where warnings and sympathies overlapped. Historians who later sifted through fragments of records disagreed as much as the people of Ash Grove had. Some argued the fire was entirely explainable as an accident, pointing to the fragility of oil lamps and the drought conditions that made Missouri homes ticklish tinder. Others leaned heavily on testimonies, suspicious reports, and the fact that Ruth had vanished, suggesting a deliberate act of arson done by a woman so tightly bound she sought freedom no matter the cost. Psychologists even weighed in a century later, pointing to her likely trauma, her years of dominance under a father infamous for control. For them, the act could be read both as rebellion and breakdown, clear-eyed revenge mixed with desperation and a fractured mind. But survivors carried more than theories. They carried scars. Even as old age crept upon them, they told their children of smoke that clung to their lungs for weeks, nightmares of hands slamming against bolted doors, the horror of breaths cut off before escape could be found. They bore the memory of neighbors screaming names of loved ones consumed inside, the silence afterward louder than any sermon could have been. And layered over all of that was the question of Ruth, an image no one could settle. Some remembered her disappearing into dawn fields, her face unreadable. Others claimed they never saw her leave but could not find her body among the dead. And so she hovered like unfinished fire, not extinguished, not alive, but surviving in imagination, eternally walking just beyond the glow of lanterns. The town never rebuilt its chapel. That blackened ground became a scar across Ash Grove each time its people passed. And with every season that passed, Ruth's story took on a different life. To some, she was a parable told from pulpits in neighboring counties about disobedience. To others, she was effectively erased, her name left behind in whispers too dangerous to preserve in formal records. Yet to more radical storytellers, especially in the early 20th century, as women fought for more freedom, Ruth Talbot was invoked like a specter of desperation, a symbol of what power structures could create when women had no voice. And that was the cruelest legacy of all. Not whether she did it with deliberate malice or whether accident played its part. It was that the truth itself burned away in the blaze, leaving only uncertainty and legend. A preacher, a congregation, and a daughter who might have been victim, killer, or both. The answers never rose from ash. Only silence did. Time passed, but the shadow of that night never lifted. Even as new churches were built in nearby towns, even as children grew up and settlers pressed onward into the frontier, the ground in Ash Grove remained haunted. Grass eventually crept across the scorched earth, weeds burying the outlines of where pews once sat, yet no one wanted to touch it, let alone build upon it. Families walked faster when they passed, and children were warned not to play near the lot. For decades, people swore they could feel the heat rise if they lingered too close, as if the earth itself remembered. What made it worse was the absence of finality. Deaths in fire were tragic enough, but tragedy usually allowed for graves, markers, and sermons of closure. Here, many families had nothing left to bury, only fragments, char that once held form, and over all of it stretched the unanswered fate of Ruth Talbot. To this day, no official record can say where she went. Some believed she moved quietly across county lines, living under a false name, never speaking of her past, perhaps even living long into old age, telling no one of the screams she had left behind. Others swore she met her end in the river nearby, her body swept down the current, leaving legend in its place. And more than a few, hardened by grief, believed she had become something less than human, less mortal, condemned to wander forever, never able to step into light again, haunted by the fire she set. Town folklore grew bolder as the years wore on. People told of a woman's figure seen at dusk, standing on the hill where Ruth had been spotted watching the fire. Lanterns carried by farmers supposedly flickered with her reflection, a face pale and unreadable. Horses balked near the ruins, refusing to pass, their breath sharp in frosty air. Travelers heard distant singing that turned shrill midway through, echoing in places no voices wandered. Each tale added another layer to Ruth's story, whether true or born of fear. Generations later, the question lingered not only in hushed conversation but in academics, historians, psychologists, and storytellers fascinated by what Ruth embodied. Was she merely a killer dressed as a daughter? Or was she a young woman ground so severely by the hand of her father that she saw no escape but destruction? Was she a monster, or was she a creation of monstrous circumstances? The line blurred as each retelling reframed her. In textbooks that occasionally touched on the event, she was summarized in a few sentences of crime. In whispered church gossip in nearby counties, her name was invoked as a warning. In the minds of those daring to peel tradition away, hers was a tale of desperation too long ignored until it burned. It is impossible to speak of Ruth without also speaking of her father. Reverend Talbot's authority had felt absolute. He had embodied the voice of God in his chapel, his word final, inscribed into the lives of his congregation in a way civil law never could. And yet, when his voice bellowed last amid smoke, when his eyes dimmed beneath collapsing beams, he was powerless to control what he had spent a lifetime trying to possess. His death, by the hands of his own daughter, smoldered into symbolic vengeance. Those who believed Ruth acted deliberately saw poisoned irony. A man who built his house on control destroyed by the rebellion of the one person he had choked most tightly. The town rebuilt in some ways, but not in others. Families grew again, but attendance in church never reached the same fervor. The authority of preachers lost its perfect luster, and many began questioning where obedience ended and tyranny began. Some whispered that Ruth's fire had burned not only walls but blind devotion itself. That was the true horror to some, that her act had cracked something that could never be repaired. Ruth's story remained chilling precisely because it offered no neat ending. Her absence pressed heavier than even her presence might have. Silence is often louder than resolution, and her disappearance left a void filled with imagination. One person saw her as cursed, another as courageous, another as insane. And all those versions lived side by side, none canceled, all true in their own way. Perhaps that is why even now, more than a century later, Ruth Talbot's fire resurfaces in documentaries, articles, and local legends, because it forces listeners into a corner, to ask at what point oppression turns victim into predator, and at what cost freedom can demand its due. Some tragedies feel random, but others are thought to be engineered by the intersection of power and desperation. Ruth's was one of those, and standing before it, one can't help but wonder not only what happened to her, but what she thought in those final moments before she walked away. Did she hear screams as torment or as a hymn of her release? Did she regret? Did she rejoice? Or did she, like the congregation, vanish into flames too fierce for truth to survive? Even today, The ground in Ash Grove is said to hold its silence differently from the fields that surround it. Locals quietly note that nothing grows as richly there, that fireweed and jagged weeds persist no matter what is planted. Whether or not there is truth in that, perhaps the soil itself did swallow something that cannot be undone. Memory, guilt, rebellion, horror, all churned into ash. Stories like Ruth's last because they touch nerves that never dull. The nerve of authority, of fear, of rebellion, of a child against a father, of faith turned into chains and chains broken by fire. It unsettles because for every condemnation of her as a monster, a quieter question follows. What if we had stood where she stood? What would we do when no one believed us, when no voice stood against tyranny, when a life stretched only as a prison of God's name spoken by a man's mouth? Would we have done differently? Or does fire live dormant in all souls waiting to be pressed too far? And that silence, that haunting question, is why the preacher's daughter has never vanished from legend. She remains less a figure of fact than a mirror in flame, reflecting everything people fear about faith twisted into power, about control breeding desperation, about innocence turning ruthless. If this story of Ruth Talbot gave you chills, share it with a friend who loves dark history and forgotten tragedies. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss the haunting stories we uncover here every week. Hit the like button to support this work and drop a comment below. Do you believe Ruth was truly guilty, or was she a victim who saw no other way out? I want to know your thoughts, because this story, like the ash it left behind, holds no clean answers, only smoke and silence, and the echo of screams carried too far into history ever to fade away. Stories do not end when the fire goes cold. In Ash Grove, whispers became as relentless as the smoke that once choked its lanes. Every child who grew up in that shadow learned quickly that there were boundaries you did not cross. You did not step into the vacant lot where the chapel once stood. You did not speak the preacher's daughter's name too plainly after dark. And you did not, under any circumstances, play with fire. For all those lessons, the memory of what had happened lingered, leaving everyone uncertain whether evil had been deliberate or accidental. But it was clear that it had left its mark. Children dared one another to creep near the ruins under moonlight, but even the boldest did not linger long. They swore the ground was still hot if you pressed your palm to the earth, though years had passed. Others claimed that sounds could still be heard in the still night, hymn singing broken midway by desperate shrieks, or fists slamming against doors in frantic rhythm. Whether those stories emerged from imagination or memory, they tightened like chains around the survivor community, keeping the terror alive long after the embers died. Farmers passing along the road late at night told of a pale figure spotted at the edge of vision, a young woman in a simple cotton gown. Ruth, some muttered, still walking. They told of her form flickering in the glow of lanterns, sometimes on the hill where she was last seen watching the church burn, sometimes in fields where the smoke had once spread. The stories always said the same, that she did not run, that she only stood silent, her face unreadable, watching. Traveling merchants, unfamiliar with local legend, would sometimes report unsettling experiences without realizing their significance. One described how his horse bolted violently near Ash Grove without cause. Another swore that as he lit a pipe near the church ruins, the flame sputtered and died, though no breeze stirred. Tales like these spread outward like ripples. By the 1880s, the preacher's daughter's story had traveled far beyond Missouri, carried by gossip and pulp novels eager to sensationalize real tragedy, and the versions multiplied. In one, Ruth became a cursed witch, condemned by God to wander the earth bearing the souls of those she killed. In another, she was elevated to something like a martyr, a symbol of rebellion against cruelty disguised as faith. Both stories bore little resemblance to the truth, but truth had already burned in the fire. What survived was imagination, shaped by grief and fear. Survivor families held their own versions. Some insisted Ruth had been guilty beyond doubt, and they told their children so. A woman who lost her husband and 2 sons in the blaze never stopped spitting Ruth's name as if cursing the air. Others were less sure. They mourned, but they spoke softly of the Reverend's hand, the way he had crushed disobedience with scripture like a hammer. They pitied Ruth as much as they condemned her. The congregation had perished, but the debate survived them, a ghost of its own. Ruth's absence gave the legend more weight than her presence ever could. Had she been captured, tried, or even executed, her story might have ended in a record line of cold history. But by disappearing, whether into river currents, distant counties, or memory itself, she left behind a vacuum filled only with stories. And in that vacuum, she became larger. By the turn of the 20th century, Ruth's tale was taught not as fact, but as folklore. School children in neighboring towns passed frightening rhymes about the preacher's daughter, daring one another to sing them near lantern flames. Preachers invoked her name as legend when warning congregations to stay obedient, and in hushed corners where radicals spoke softly of freedom, women invoked Ruth with sympathy, whispering that sometimes fire was the only escape from cages built too tightly. Researchers combing through Ash Grove archives in later decades found almost nothing solid. Records had burned with the chapel. Witnesses contradicted one another. Ruth left no confirmed diary to explain her mind. The most haunting evidence was absence itself, an erased trail where she had been, as though the fire had swallowed not only lives but proof. One historian noted that in this silence, the town filled in the void with whatever answered its own guilt. What still unsettles is how active Ruth remained in the imagination after death. Touring singers adapted her into murder ballads sung in river taverns. Artists painted crude pamphlet covers with ghostly women in flame. Story gatherers at the turn of the century documented how locals still crossed themselves when passing the burned lot, a gesture that was half prayer and half superstitious ward. A tragedy can fade, but a figure, especially a woman marked as both guilty and trapped, has a way of sticking, and so Ruth Talbot lived on. Some imagined her footsteps in every unexplained creak of wood, her breath in every flicker of lantern flame. Others exercised their grief by making her a demon, an alien thing apart from themselves. Children became teenagers. Teenagers' parents, parents' grandparents, but each retelling hardened Ruth's legend into something no less potent for its uncertainty. The preacher's daughter became not only what she was, but whatever people needed her to be, a warning. A curse, a ghost, or a tragic mirror of what happens when obedience and oppression collide. Time has a way of sanding down the sharp edges of tragedy, dulling details until only broad strokes remain. But the story of the preacher's daughter never dulled. It remained jagged, cutting new generations long after those who lived it turned to dust. Children who had not even been born at the time of the fire grew up feeling that they knew Ruth Talbot, because her shadow lingered in every hymn sung too loudly, in every church door locked too firmly, and in every lantern flame that flickered longer than it should have. The enduring power of her story rests not in certainty but in doubt. If she had confessed, if she had been captured, if she had faced trial, her legacy might have been sealed in ink and judgment. Instead, her absence became the canvas upon which everyone painted their own version. For some, she was little more than a murderer whose rebellion crossed the line into atrocity. To others, she was a victim caught in machinery larger than herself, a young woman driven to desperate measures by a father's unyielding will. And to yet others, she was both, a child forged in chains who shattered them with fire, leaving only ruin behind. That is why Ruth's name endures more like a ghost story than a piece of documented history. She shifts in every retelling to reflect the fears and values of the one doing the telling. Pastors turned her into a parable of obedience gone astray. Women whispered that she was a symbol of endurance pushed too far. And locals, haunted by too many screams, infused her with superstition, seeing her in flames, hearing her in the wind, refusing to let her rest in one definition. That ambiguity may be why so many are still compelled by her story today. We want simple truths, but the fire left none. All it gave was ash, smoke, and silence forces imagination. Did Ruth slip into another town, folding dresses in anonymity while her past clung like smoke never scrubbed clean? Did she drown that night, her body unclaimed, her story magnified precisely because her ending was unseen? Or did she vanish into history, her figure kept alive not by fact but by need, the need to explain how something so unthinkable could have happened? Every tragedy asks us questions we cannot always answer. Ruth asks more than most. How far can authority stretch before it cracks the very souls it controls? How do years of silence, humiliation, and confinement transform a daughter into someone capable of striking the match that engulfs not just a tyrant, but a whole town? Was the act justice, madness, rebellion, or revenge? And when we tell the story, whose guilt are we really confronting? Hers, her father's, the congregation's, or our own as listeners who cannot stop retelling it? Even now, those questions matter because they echo larger truths. History is filled with tales of authority wielded too harshly, of communities turning their eyes to convenience and away from cruelty, of individuals breaking beneath pressure until their choices spiral into devastation. Ruth's fire may belong to Ash Grove, but the pattern belongs everywhere. That, too, makes her story endure. And in the haunting silence left behind, her memory lives, not as something neatly righteous or purely monstrous, but as a reminder that humanity is capable of both suffering and inflicting unspeakable things when cornered. It chills us because we wonder, if pushed as far as she was, what choices would we make? The preacher's daughter became a legend not because she was understood, but because she never was. The fire burned away evidence, and all that remained was conflict between obedience and rebellion, faith and oppression, guilt and survival. That tension is what keeps her story alive more than a century later, retold wherever people gather to speak of dark history. And maybe that is the true lesson, that history rarely gives clean lines. Sometimes it hands us smoke, and we have to decide what shapes we see in it. We turn the past into mirrors because we crave meaning. Ruth is a mirror. Some see sin, some see survival, some see courage, all see fire. If this unsettling story of the preacher's daughter gave you chills, share it with a friend who loves forgotten history and haunting mysteries. And if you want more stories of darkness buried in America's past, make sure you subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss the next tale we bring to light. Hit the like button to show your support, and most importantly, tell me in the comments, what do you believe Ruth really was? A murderer overcome by madness? A victim crushed until she broke? A martyr of rebellion? Or all of these at once? Your answer matters because this legend does not live in facts. It lives in the voices that keep retelling it. And tonight, in listening, you have become part of that story. So as you close your eyes, remember the flicker of lantern flame, the crash of collapsing rafters, the silent figure walking away while fire devoured the faithful inside. Remember the questions left in smoke. And remember that some ghosts do not vanish, because we need them to remind us of what lies on the farthest edge of silence, obedience, and control. What will you remember of Ruth Talbot? That is the ember still burning, waiting to spread again whenever her name is spoken aloud.